The story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Upbuilding the Self and to our fourth and final episode of this miniseries on nonviolent communication. I am Michael Sloyer, and I am here with Hari and Rasanath. It's great to be with you guys today.
Likewise. Same. Thank you.
So it's a little bittersweet that we're wrapping up this miniseries. It's been a real joy to record these episodes with you and to take ourselves and our audience on this journey through nonviolent communication. So just to recap where we've been so far, in the first episode, we talked about the difference between needs and strategies and how we want to look underneath our strategies to really see what is that driving force need that we have, the why behind how we're feeling. In the second episode, we talked about the connection between needs and feelings very explicitly. And in the third, we put it all together by talking about the OFNR acronym, which stands for observations, feelings, needs, and requests, which is a very helpful acronym to follow when we are communicating first with ourselves about what we're going through and what we might need and what we're requesting of somebody else. And then also when we actually go and communicate that externally. So we've covered really the key teachings of the nonviolent communication framework. And today we're going to be looking at what are some of the limitations and what's actually beyond NVC. So Hari, you have shared in the past to me that NVC will only take us so far. Can you share what you meant by that?
Yes, it's similar to our work with the Enneagram personality typology, which we lean on so heavily at Upbuild and which we've seen the transformative impact of wherever we go, where our Enneagram teachers, Don and Russ at the Enneagram Institute, they would say, see, the Enneagram will only take you so far. You need a spiritual practice to go beyond. You need to actually go outside the realm of the ego and the sphere that I know. If I really want to hit transcendence, or if I really want to transcend my ego, I have to go outside of it. And so when we're talking about NVC, there is the same need. And NVC deliberately does not talk about the ego versus the self. That's not really part of the construct. Whereas for us at Upbuild, that is the essence of everything. And it's the reason why we employ NVC to help us see things and function in a way that it removes layers of ego and aligns more with the self. But then there is a certain juncture where we realize this isn't going to get me to the full self.
Thank you for that introduction. So we talked about some of the needs as we shared in our last few episodes and gave lots of examples. We talked about core needs that we have, things like connection, appreciation, recognition, community. These are all basic needs that we have. So why, if they're so basic, do they not fully get us to the real self? Why do they not fully get us to where we want to go?
Well, I can just say that my own experience and my experience observing everybody else in this world is that those needs are never fully met. And that is a profound thing to sit with. When we're using NVC, rightfully so, we get excited about the meeting of needs more effectively than without the framework. And that is super helpful. And it is really a brilliant framework for understanding my needs, helping them get met, and even in some ways, more importantly, tapping into the deeper need, which is aligned with the real self, to serve other people, to actually help meet their needs. That is intoxicating. And Marshall Rosenberg had that experience of just sort of dancing around the world with people finding connection, finding an affectionate spirit of connection by helping meet their needs. And in so doing, getting a lot of reciprocation and feeling his own deeper needs being met. So the issue is that intoxicating effect can serve to put a veil over our eyes for the fact that my needs are never really fully met.
Because of the focus of nonviolent communication is taking responsibility for our needs. When we take full responsibility for our needs, we will also acknowledge the fact that the infinite nature of our needs, it runs so deep that it can't be fully met by anyone in this world. And imagine the burden that we put on people when we expect them to fulfill our needs. And at the same time, again, based on how nonviolent communication talks about needs, we can't just dismiss our needs. So this is a very subtle, perhaps even an unconscious way in which sometimes gratitude can be employed. Gratitude, yes, we have to be grateful for what we have been given. Absolutely. But many times, gratitude becomes a way of masking our disappointment that our infinite needs will never be met. So I have to settle. And the most positive way of settling is gratitude. So then that gratitude actually masks the honesty of taking responsibility and really looking at, well, how deep do my needs run?
This is provocative. It feels like an understatement here. I feel myself physically getting uncomfortable as you both are speaking about this idea that we've never really had our needs met. And I'm sure many of us have thought, or at least can remember back to good times at some point when our needs were being met. But it's quite provocative to hear, no, actually, your needs have never fully been met. And that's why you've never fully been satisfied. And then also to take it a step further, it can't be met in this material world, through these material eyes, in this material paradigm, this way of looking at the world. And Rasanath, also very provocative what you shared about gratitude being maybe an unconscious strategy that we use to convince ourselves that we actually have met our needs, or that they've been met to enough of an extent where we're okay, but really we're actually not okay.
Which is many times in the expression of gratitude, it seems very stoic. And it may seem very like, yeah, I feel very grateful too, or I feel very grateful for. And even in its expression, we may not experience the fullness of our heart many times because we have settled. And while we may not feel disturbed at that point, there is not the fullness that we may experience.
There's something else. There's this, and I hear this from people a lot. It's almost like well, what more could you ask for? I have what I need. I'm good. Everything is fine. Everything is great, actually. Everything is great. What more could you ask for? And we're saying there's a lot more to ask for. That's settling. And it's not ungrateful to do that. It's actually heeding a deeper call.
And the reason why the ego finds it so disconcerting and provocative is because in the statement, so the ego basically will say, okay, so how can I help you fulfill it? And if you were to truly ask the question, the ego has to encounter the very difficult answer that the ego, by all of its infinite strategies and means, will never be able to fulfill it. Because the depth of that longing is coming from a very different place. And this is the corridor of entry into spiritual life. And as Hermann Hesse so beautifully points to it, in terms of what he speaks about, what is the primary drive towards our spiritual journey, or going towards the spiritual journey, he says our only guide is our homesickness. And what he means by that is there is this infinite longing that pulls us to inquire. And without that, we would never really inquire. And so if we tap into that longing, that never really ends. We have to step forward into taking a spiritual journey.
We recorded an episode called An Existential Crisis as an Opportunity for Growth. And what you both are talking about is the corridor of spirituality through an existential crisis. And one of the ways that people experience an existential crisis is from this feeling of, okay, I'm so grateful for this. I'm so grateful for that. I have everything in my life, but I'm still not satisfied. And what the heck is going on? Because there's nothing more for me to have, or it's just so marginal compared to what I've gotten up until this point that I know it's not going to really move the needle, but there's still this deep longing or this deep hole that I feel within. And I'm wondering now, how is it possible for this to be satisfied?
And the best is the way it expresses itself is, I'm just bored with life. That's an existential crisis, right? Just the boredom of life itself. What is that indicative of? It's indicative of there's something much deeper that's wanting to be stimulated, that despite having everything material, I still can't seem to satisfy it.
I would want to frame it like this. So there's a spectrum between the ego and the self. If you put the ego on the left side of the pole and then the self on the right side, there is a spectrum in between. And this is what makes up levels of consciousness, as we speak about, especially in our Enneagram work. But in much of our work, we talk about how we need to climb up the levels of consciousness from the ego to the self. The more identified with, the more aligned we are with the ego, the lower our level of consciousness. The more aligned we are with the self, the more identified with it, the more we fuel it, then the more we raise our consciousness. And when we're fully identified with the self, then we're liberated. We're at the liberated level of consciousness, which is beyond anything else. And here we see NVC is taking us closer to the self, because the self does serve other people and feel great joy and gratitude in doing so. And it's unlocking qualities of a higher consciousness. But this is where good becomes the enemy of great. This is where I feel the contentment and I stop. And I was sharing before this podcast a verse from the Bhagavad Gita that was coming to my mind, which I think is so fitting here. It's so perfect, where Krishna actually coaches Arjuna saying, when you reach a certain threshold of consciousness, you will think there is no greater happiness. And it sounds positive. It sounds like, wow, amazing. I can't wait to reach that time when I will think there's no greater happiness. But then we have to zoom in, and the key is the word think. You will think there is no greater happiness. But what he's actually saying is, that's the problem. You'll think there's no greater happiness, but there is. You can go right for the self and the full realization. Whereas at a certain point, NVC, the Enneagram, and different frameworks that help us to cultivate higher consciousness within the material sphere, they have a blocker. It won't take me beyond.
So we're saying these frameworks are very valuable because they help make our egos healthy. And we actually need a healthy ego. Rasanath, you'll often share this. We need a healthy ego in order to get beyond it. So it's not that we don't need these frameworks. We really need these frameworks, but we have to know all along that they're not the end all be all. They're not going to get us to where we ultimately want to get to.
Exactly.
That's one thing. The other thing is that we also settle with these frameworks.
Yes.
Right? We settle with these frameworks and say, okay, this is great. And that's where it comes down to relativism, where we feel like, okay, if it's making me better than most people, that's good. But that is still not the discovery of the true self. It's the ego still hinging on, relativism. So if we have to go beyond, if we need to transcend and fully come in touch with our true self, then these frameworks will let us off at a certain place. And that will be the place of actual spiritual practice.
So let's push on this idea a little bit more, because we talk about the different needs, like communication, like connection, as all being tied to the deepest need for love. And even NVC will speak about this, how love is really the core need that ties it all together. And love is also a spiritual need as well. It's actually the spiritual need, from what I understand. So how do we make sense of this, that NVC doesn't fully take us there, even though it does acknowledge that love is the deepest need?
We can acknowledge that love is the deepest need because we can experience it. We see, I haven't come across a single living entity, human and otherwise, that don't seek out love. And so it's very, very tangible. And at the same time, the realm that we try to seek it out from, where we try to get it from, and this goes back to the NVC framework where we talk about people, location,
Action.
time, and objects, going back to the Plato framework. Even when NVC talks about how we need to suspend that when we have to tap into our need, ultimately, what do we have to do when we have to meet those needs? We still have to come back to those very 5 things, which means that we are trying to meet something that is coming from a spiritual place with things that are still in the material realm. And so when that is the limitation of the framework, it still is looking to satisfy those things in the material realm. It naturally brings with it limits because the origin of those needs are spiritual. So they can only be met with, fully satisfied with, by something that is spiritual. So here is where the mismatch happens. So you're right that love is a spiritual need. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, do we have a spiritual practice that meets that need from a spiritual place? And if we don't have that, then it will be impossible to meet that need.
Okay, so I want to come back and ask you about meeting the spiritual needs with the spiritual practice. So let's just put a pin in that for a second. And just to reflect back what you shared about Plato, and as a review for our audience, we talked about this in the first episode of the miniseries, Plato being the acronym PLATO, stands for people, location, action, time, and objects. And if any of those are involved in a need that you might share, like I need you to have dinner with me a few times a week, as we used as an example from the last episode, that's not actually a need, because there's a person, there's an action, and there's a time, and it's actually strategy that I'm asking the other person to be a part of in order to meet that need. And what I hear you saying now is that even if we use that framework very successfully and we're able to see that I have a need for connection, or I have a need for love, or I have a need for appreciation, and I don't put it on you specifically to meet that need, I still eventually need to go out and seek that connection that I'm looking for from other people. And that's still material.
Going back to how you framed your question, a spiritual need is only met with material reciprocation. And that never quite fulfills. It's like, I give this example a lot, right? And this is a completely material example, but it might be relatable. When we have had the best pizza that we have ever had, and then we go to other places that still advertise that they're making pizza, that may even externally look like the pizza that I had. But when I put it in my mouth, I say, and we have said this too, yeah, it's good. It's just not the same. And that's the feeling we are left with. It's just not the same. It's just not the same. And that can only be met with when we meet our spiritual needs from a spiritual place.
And it should be said that all of these needs practically are coming from the soul, with the exception, I may have mentioned this in the previous episode, with the exception of those that are exclusively pertaining to the physical body. But if you talk about autonomy, you talk about connection, you talk about belonging, being seen, appreciation, all of these are actually coming from the self. And that's why they won't stop hounding us. And that's why we feel how deep and core they are, because they do come from the self and they are spiritual. And yes, they all boil down to two things: to love and be loved. You can subsume every need into that broad bucket of, I just want to love and be loved. And that is from the self. That is therefore spiritual. If we understand that the self is spiritual, it's of a different quality. And at the same time, we're trying to go around this world filling them with poor substitutes. We're trying to fill them in ways that don't touch the spiritual dimension. And we can then easily say, well, hey, it's spiritual. I feel great when somebody appreciates me. But how does that make it spiritual? What makes that spiritual? Spiritual means related to the spirit. It means that there's something that you're doing which is activating the soul proper with great intentionality, and that requires its own framework. That is not something we can make up. That's something which is given to us.
So before we get into spiritual practice, one more thing that we were speaking a little bit about before we were recording was about how even when these needs are met in a material sense, one of the problems is that it's so temporary. It's so short-lived.
The limitation with material things is the depth to which they can meet our need. Now, even in the most exceptional cases, when we say, you know what, it meets my need fully, we know at the back of our mind that there is an expiry date, right? So the setup is fragile. And sometimes we think that, okay, since the setup is fragile in the sense that there is an expiry date, let me try to transcend the need by that time. So I will have this person meet my need, but before that person leaves, dies, I will just grow beyond it. And that also doesn't happen. And this is the other fallacy. These needs are not something that we will ever transcend. They are the needs of the spirit. And those needs have to be met on the spiritual level continuously.
Eternally, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why there is no escape to me. When you think about this, there is really no escape other than stepping into the foray of a spiritual practice.
See, we can't take any of this stuff with us after we die. None of it. None of it. The only thing we can do is recognize that there is something in us that is begging for eternity, and which will only be satisfied when we touch eternity. And so if we stay in the sphere of the temporal, we will always face that frustration. And Soren Kierkegaard pointed this out profoundly. I mean, this was my own life transformation. It was all ignited by his pointing out this paradigm, this equation, that we're filled with infinite longings and finite capacity to fulfill them. So simple, so clear. Boom, that's it. Infinite longings, finite capacity to fulfill them. There is unlimited possibility that intoxicates us. And then there is necessity, which demands we can only do so much, and we're so constrained. And the self doesn't want to be constrained. So what he's saying is the self cannot be constrained. And this is artificial. It's all artificial to settle for what is there that we can perceive with our senses, or even the metaphysical realm of the material of dealing in these kinds of needs that are not spiritual or that are not fulfilled in a spiritual way, but are using the objects of this world, Plato of this world. It doesn't work. And I was so angry that he was pointing this out, because I was like, no, I'm grateful. I'm a happy person. I'm grateful. My whole life is laid out before me. The world is my oyster. I'm a good person. I connect with people really well. I'm loving and I'm loved. I mean, I was trying to take the NVC approach before I knew what NVC was. And I was like, this is great. What's the problem? And Kierkegaard was puncturing a hole in it. And I was like, how dare you? You can't do that to me. And until I pondered more what he was saying. I introspected more than I was comfortable with, way more than I was comfortable with. And I said, oh my God, he's right. And I put up the white flag. And then I became a Kierkegaardian. And I started reading his books and seeing, wow, this person is very realized. And he's talking that we need to go to the real self, which is spiritual, which cannot be fulfilled by the things of this world. And the ethical plane, or the plane of worldly good, or things like, helping serve each other's needs in the ways that we're talking about with NVC, it's not enough. It's begging us to go deeper. It's begging us to go beyond. We'll never be satisfied with that. Be honest.
Yeah, and I don't need to trust you to have confidence in what you're saying. I just think back on a few relationships that I had when I was younger, where the first date is amazing and I'm in love with this person, and like I've gotten my need for love, and I'm never, this is just good. And maybe it lasts 2 dates and 3 days, and that's what they call the honeymoon period, and then that comes to an end. And I haven't been married 50 years, but even for people who have gone through the honeymoon period and gotten all the way into something like that, which feels like this is true love and this is a relationship that I will have forever. Forever just means until these bodies expire. And so in both extremes, where I just meet somebody for 1 day or I've been with somebody for 50 or more years, there's still so much temporality to both of them.
And I have an outstanding time with a friend and I feel a loving connection. Then what? It's already diminishing as I'm looking at the clock. Oh, I have to go back to my life.
Okay, so let's come back to this question of meeting our spiritual needs through spiritual practices. How can we do that? And how does that actually move us towards what we're talking about here, more moving towards the real self?
This is a very vast topic that will require putting the foundations. And Hari Prasad already described, as soon as you say spiritual, and this is also something that we see so commonly, that we say spiritual, but subconsciously and unconsciously, we are still talking about something that is material and nice. Spiritual means that which pertains to the spirit. Now, here's the question. I don't even know what that is. Right? I don't even know what the spirit is and where to begin. So the only step I would offer to start with is to actually begin with trying to understand what spirit is. And that means engaging with literatures that actually talk about the spirit. And we have brought, Hari Prasad has already talked about 2 of them, the Bhagavad Gita, and if you go to yoga traditions, you'll see a lot of books that directly talk about the spirit. Kierkegaard, as a writer, directly talks about the spirit. So this is where it begins. We have to study first in order to understand what spirit is. And then the step after that would be then, okay, so then how do we engage the spirit in a spiritual practice? So this is a very, very vast topic, but I would say the first step lies in sincere exploration and study of what spirit is.
It's also noteworthy that NVC as paradigm is one that essentially promotes a kind of moral relativism. Now, NVC would never say that. NVC has strong values and great goodness to it, but there's a way in which it's saying, hey, we're all subjective beings that have our subjective experience, and who's to say that one is more right than another? There's a lot of questioning of those principles of rightness, and the idea is to just try to see what is a need, how you can empathize with it, and fulfill that for yourself and other people. And that's wonderful. It's incredible. And it leaves something lacking, where if your truth is as good as my truth, how do we explain the way the world is? How do we explain so much of the injustice and the cruelty? And it goes on and on. But what we're really desperately seeking is a fabric that connects us. And NVC helps with that. But there's so much more that is needed, because the fabric that connects us also means an absolute, something which we can all mutually recognize and rely on, a paradigm, a set of principles that stops the division and which is addressing discord between us. Because if your reality and my reality are both just our realities, that doesn't address the need for something which binds us, which actually connects us in a much deeper way, a fabric that allows us to live in the same reality according to the same absolute understanding of what that reality is. And so that's where, again, sacred texts are critical. They're critical because they are that binding force. They are the force that says, hey, this is what the reality is. And we can both step into it, leaving our subjective realities behind and also formulating our new subjective realities within the context of an absolute objective reality. Otherwise, we'll always feel we're not connected enough. There'll always be that discord.
So what I'm taking from both of you is that we need to study, because we need to first recognize that even though we might want to be spiritual or have heard the benefits of it and maybe even practiced for a long time, maybe we've been meditators for a long time, or we've engaged in spiritual retreats and been a retreat junkie, Hari, as your guru will share sometimes, or have engaged in going to religious institutions and trying to be more spiritual. A lot of us need to look and really own the fact that we don't truly know what the spirit actually is and what real spirituality is. So studying, and then the next step, but I think can also be done alongside that, is to start to try to have some of our own spiritual-ish experiences or experiences that feel more spiritual and can build on each other over time, so that we can also build up some confidence on our own that this is the right path. Because without that, it's hard to just take somebody else's word for it.
Absolutely. And in the study of the spirit, it's like a user manual, right? And what happens many times is as we move forward in the pages of the user manual to actually just go to the place that I need now. But it doesn't, I don't fully understand how the entire mechanics operates. And what will be important here is, as we study the spirit, I agree with you that alongside that, there can be a practice, but the practice will not make full sense without the basics of understanding what spirituality. So, for example, I can say that one of the practices is meditation. We all have an understanding of what meditation is. And many times meditation is used as a tool to lower anxiety, to have clarity, to have more focus, all of which are material. Now, when we talk about meditation, or when all wisdom traditions talk about meditation, they don't negate these effects, but they say that these are the effects, these are the byproduct of tapping into a higher spiritual reality, right? And how does meditation as a practice work to understand that will only make full sense when we understand the nature of the spirit. So meditation is definitely a tool, but we approach the practice of meditation very differently when we understand how it pertains to the spirit.
Yeah, that's critical.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. And Hari, just to reflect back what you shared, which I think is really critical about getting to some not only common framework, but absolute framework that we can agree on, so that it's not just anything goes. And I don't think NVC is saying that anything goes, but it can devolve. It can devolve into that. If I state that I have some need and you state that you have some need, and now we're both desiring that the other person meets that need for us.
Even that, from NVC's standpoint, is legitimate. Like if you're saying you have this need and I'm saying I have this need, yeah, you both need to meet your needs. The issue is more around the philosophical rigor, that it's very difficult to justify how one thing would be wrong and another thing right. This is where you get the moral relativism. And you can see even within the framework of NVC, some of these challenges showing up. Like, for example, Marshall Rosenberg, he talks about having giraffe ears versus jackal ears. Giraffe ears being the positive and jackal ears being the negative. So when you perceive with giraffe ears, you're just listening for needs and wanting to love and serve the person. When you're listening with jackal ears, you're just hearing what's wrong and what you're not getting, and you're really like agitated. But inherent in that is a value judgment. Giraffe good and jackal bad. And that's not quite accommodated with this moral relativism. Like if we can't come to an absolute reality of right and wrong, how do we explain why giraffe is good and jackal is bad? There's no way to explain it. Now, Marshall Rosenberg, he was a spiritualist in some way, and he was a wonderful person, a very, very empowered, extraordinary person. And he may have had an answer to some of these things. And there are other teachers within NVC who are much more expert than I am. And they may have their own ways of dealing with these things in or outside of NVC, with different frameworks, with their own beliefs. And some of them incorporate spiritual practices. But the point is, with this setup, we're encouraged to go material without exploring and unpacking the challenge with the material frame, right? The material frame is so limiting, and that has to be exposed. And even some of the intricacies of NVC, we would do well to examine through another lens.
So we're going to start to move into close here, and we're going to close two separate things. The first is this particular episode and this topic that we've been talking about of moving beyond NVC through spiritual practice. And then we'll talk about closing the miniseries. So in closing of this particular topic, is there anything that either of you would like to share?
Don't settle. Don't settle. These needs are calling you deeper. There's so much more to them. It's actually insulting to our very self when we think like, oh, I had a great time last night, my needs got met. That's not what this is about. The needs are pointing to something else. There is an infinite well of longing. We need that longing. That is the greatest thing that we have. That's why, as Rasanath mentioned, Hermann Hesse would say that your homesickness is your only guide. Tap into that. Remember the Kierkegaardian equation, the finitude and the infinitude. It's irreconcilable in this world, and it must be reconciled. But the only way to do that is to admit, this doesn't work. I am kidding myself. I am placating myself with something lesser, and myself will not rest until I go for the real thing, the spirit.
That was so deep and inspiring. I'm not sure that I want to move on to the next closing, but it has been an incredible experience to be with the two of you over these last 4 episodes for this miniseries. So first of all, thank you for all the insight and the wisdom that you shared. And I feel like I have a much better understanding of nonviolent communication as a result of being in community and connection with the two of you around this framework, as we've discussed preparation and preparing for each of the episodes, and then in actually unpacking them while recording. It's brought so much more and more light and inspiration to what we're talking about here. What would both of you like to share in closing this mini-series here?
The feeling is so mutual. Thank you, Michael. It's really wonderful. And for me, taking stock of what I've gotten to learn through NVC has been exceptional. I've been waiting for this opportunity for years. It's really, really special. And what I would like to offer to others is, please use the framework of understanding your inner world through the breakdown that is so expert, so perfect, of needs, feelings, and then also taking the OFNR observations, feelings, needs, and making requests. As NVC would say, you can also make requests of yourself, which is wonderful. So would you be willing to do this to meet your own need? And it's just illuminating, and it's so grounding and helps us to be better human beings. Really, it does. And I have this experience myself consistently. And it also helps us to empathize with other people and to really reflect back. So it sounds like maybe you have this need, or I'm so interested. Are you feeling this way? I'm hearing that you're feeling this way. And I sense maybe you have a need for this. And people feel so touched and so connected. It's very healing. So there's no need to diminish the beauty of that. And at the same time, there's so much more where that came from. This is not even scratching the surface. So if we stop there, it's a gross injustice to the potential of what these needs are pointing at. And that is the heart of it all.
Thank you, Hari Prasad and Rasanath.
Nothing more to add. Fully satisfied.
Okay. All your needs have been met. Except the deepest need of them all, because Hari and I cannot do that for you.
Well, because of how Bill's mission is so directly spiritually oriented, as we walk together, I feel the needs of the spirit being met in incredible ways that I can't otherwise explain. So thank you both for your striving.
Thank you, everyone, for being on this journey with us. We're so grateful to be with you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.